From Anshe Sfard Beth El Emeth Congregation, it's time to take 10 Minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.
Welcome to our discussion of Parashat Shemot, the untold story of the Exodus. If we ask ourselves, what is the purpose of the redemption of the Jews from Egypt? Surely you'd say, to get out of slavery. There's actually more to it than that. If you look at the Ramban and his overview of the entire book in his introduction to the book of Shemot, he says that the purpose of this Exodus is to go back to Ma'alat Avotam. They're to return to the level of their forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The Jews, no doubt, had grown far from God. The purpose of this book is to bring them back to the level of their forefathers. As Moshe says to Hashem, how do I know that it is you who sent me? What is the sign? So he says, who am I? So he says, don't worry, I'll give you a sign. When you go to worship God on this mountain, that will be a sign that I have sent you. Ibn Ezra understands that what he's saying is, in the Ibn Ezra Katzar, in the abridged version of the Ibn Ezra, he says, why did I send you? What is your mission? What is the purpose of the Exodus? To worship God on this mountain, Mount Sinai. And that's what it says in Vayikra Chav Bet Lamed Gimel, in the end of Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Hamotzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, God is the one who took us out of Egypt, liyot lachem lelokim, in order to be your God. We say it in the Shema as well in the last paragraph. The purpose of Exodus is to make God our God. What does that mean? We often gloss over the implications of that. We took us out of Egypt to make God our God. In other words, before we went out of Egypt, God in some way was not our God. What do I mean? If you look at the repartee between God and Moshe at the burning bush, he says, "V'amruli ma shemo, ma omar alehem." If they ask me, who is this God? What do I say? Why don't the Jews know who this God is? The answer is, in Egypt, the Jews began to feel like they didn't know God. Hashem turns to Moshe and he says that you should go to Paro and tell him, we're going to worship God. Implication, before Sinai, the Jews were not worshiping God. They were forced in Egypt, they landed out in Egypt worshiping idols. The Rabbeinu Hananel, in his commentary on the verse, that they're going to go for 3 days to worship in the desert. Is that it? The Rabbeinu Hananel says, is that true? I mean, that the only purpose of the Exodus was to go worship God for a couple of days in the desert? He says, no, that's not a lie. That's the beginning. Just like Abraham was told very gradually, take your son. Which son? Oh, your only son, the one you love. Gradually, he was exposed to what the full magnitude of the law was. So too, the Jews began their journey back to God, back to the level of their forefathers, with worshiping for 3 days. But the ultimate message was the entire embrace of the entire Torah to be restored to the level of their ancestors. Ibn Kaspi says that first they were told about their physical exodus, and later they're told about their spiritual exodus. Here in our parsha, we have the notion the spiritual exodus is alluded to, both in the idea that you will worship me on this mountain, Tavdun es Elokim al harazeh, Mizbechal Hashem Elokeinu, that they should tell Paro they're going to go worship God. They're not just getting out of Egypt to get out of slavery. They're going to Egypt. They're getting out of Egypt in order to worship God. But the full-blown mission of the Jews to get out of Egypt is not told in this parsha at all, but is told in round 2, where God begins to zero in further and further on the actual mission that they have. And that is, I want to be your God. I want them to be your people. I want you to know that God is your God, who takes you out of the suffering of Egypt. The Zohar says that apparently when they get out of Egypt, they'll know that God is God. Until then, they didn't know that God was God. The secret, the untold story of the Exodus is that in Egypt, the Jews had forgotten God almost completely. And the idea of the Exodus is not simply to get out of slavery, let my people go. But the idea of the Exodus is to restore God as our God, as he was in the previous book. The last book was about Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who had found God, who had God, who were the Merkavah, the resting place of Shekhinah, of the divine presence. This parsha is about the restoring God to be our God. And therefore at Mount Sinai, Hashem says to us, "Vatim tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh," you will be my holy people. Until now, they had forgotten their mission. In Egypt, they had forgotten that. Unless you think this is some radical theory that I have, in fact, it's very clear and explicit in Yechezkel. And there it says very clearly that they did not listen to Moshe. Moshe told them, each one should throw away their idols. And they didn't listen to Moshe. And Rashi there in Yechezkel says in Perek Chaf, chapter 20, that most of the Jews, because they didn't listen to Moshe, they didn't throw away their idols, they died in the plague of Choshech. According to Rashi in the Midrash, 1 out of 5 people, some say even more, died in Egypt. They didn't get out of Egypt because they refused to find God again. What is the Exodus? Yes, it's a physical exodus from Egypt. But what is it really all about? What's the untold story? The untold story is that they had lost their God. In Egypt, they had lost their way completely. God wasn't their God. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what his name was. On the contrary, they worshipped idols. It's a sad and untold story, perhaps for good reason. We don't usually emphasize this part of the story. And what is the Exodus? What is this book? It's a book of rediscovering God to the point where God will rest in the center of the Jewish people. They'll march forward with God in their center. God will rest in the tabernacle. That's the redemption, not just redemption from Egypt. This book is not over when they get out of Egypt. It's over when God is in their midst. That's the untold story. And that ultimately is the story of this book. The rabbis call Sefer HaGeulah, the book of redemption. The way we're looking at it, the Ramban alluded to it, redemption not just physical, but redemption spiritually to rediscover our own God. Thank you for joining us here at the Anshe Sfar Beth El Emet congregation. We dedicate our learning today to my father of blessed memory, Reb Baruch, Reb Chayim Shmuel, just recently passed away. He's Reb Baruch, may his memory be a blessing. I want to thank Jason Lefkowitz for making today's presentation possible. Thank you.
This has been 10 Minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.